I only have 17 pages of notes typed. I kind of went a little overboard. I spent a lot of time researching all the martyrs, but we might not get through it all today. We have a Facebook page of people who are in the march this time, and we stay in pretty close contact with each other. We got to be really close. And someone posted the question this week on that page, what was the most powerful day for you? And most people couldn't name just one. Each day was very different. They were all powerful in their own way. The first day, as I talked about last week, it was powerful to be in such historic places like Brown Chapel, which is where the whole movement began, to walk across the bridge, to see all the folk art and things commemorating all of that was very, very powerful. The second day we didn't see anything that was so powerful. We walked 13 miles in the rain on Highway 80 in Alabama, which is not exactly a scenic highway, and it's very rural. We maybe passed a couple of little churches and convenience stores, and that was about it. But it was powerful because we kept thinking back to the people who walked in the rain 50 years ago, and that had its own power. Day 3 was, again, a 13-mile day on the road. We didn't really pass anything of great interest, except for one thing, which we'll get to. But it's the day that our rangers dedicated to the martyrs. And as we walked, the lines from the Lift Every Voice and Sing kept coming through my mind. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. You know those lines from that hymn, which we sing. And it really, those words really came alive on for the whole march, but especially on this day. This is Nigel, the singing ranger. Again, let me put another plug in, as I did the last time for the National Park Service that put this whole thing together. Someone asked how many people there were. There were 300 because the original march, when the court order came down allowing the march, they limited it to 300 people because they thought that was a safe number, a number that could be guarded and protected. And Highway 80 is now a 4-lane highway. Then it was a 2-lane highway, so they didn't want to block more than one lane. The park rangers, mostly they were from the southeast, who came and put this together. There were over 100 rangers it took to do this. There were a group that traveled with us, and then there was a group at the National Park Center, which is halfway between Selma and Montgomery, who did all the logistical work, which was pretty amazing. Nigel is stationed in New Orleans there's the National Park Service dedicated to the music of New Orleans, and he's stationed there. And he's a wonderful musician himself, and he led us in song every day, and you have to figure out, this is a video.
Oh,
I don't know how to do
just take a picture.
We started every morning singing. flavor. Music was a huge part of the movement 50 years ago. I learned a lot of the freedom songs that they sang on the march. We sang. The Rangers knew them all and taught them to us if we didn't already know them. And it did make a difference. When you were really tired, somebody would start singing, and the whole group would sing, and it really lifted you up. So it was a good lesson in how important music was. Okay, here we are to the Martyrs. One of the things that they said on this day, we finally marched past the place where Viola Liuzzo was murdered, and there's a monument to her there. The four martyrs around the whole Selma movement. Of course, you have Martin Luther King in the middle, who was, as we know, martyred later. The first is Jimmie Lee Jackson, and then we're going to go into, I'll tell the stories of each one of them, but Jimmie Lee Jackson, the Reverend James Reeb, Viola Liuzzo, who's the only white woman who was killed in the whole civil rights movement, and Jonathan Daniels, who was an Episcopalian. So we're going to tell their story. But I think everybody was a little concerned on this day because we felt really good and exhausted at the end of Sunday, which is the day we walked 13 miles in the rain. And by the time we finished that, even the people who were in really fit shape were tired. And I think every part of me ached. And I felt so good that I had done it, and then I thought, oh my God, I've got to get up and do it again tomorrow. And in some ways, this was the day that I was most concerned about, and other people too, because those were the two longest days. And I thought, how am I going to do this when I'm already so tired? But actually, it wasn't that hard. This day, I guess we just got into the rhythm of it. And so I was fine by the end of this day. But the Rangers said, anytime anyone gets tired, raise your hand, number 4, to remember the 4 martyrs. And people would do that, and everybody would have their 4 fingers up, and we would remember why we were there, and it would give us energy. Now this is a mural that was painted on the side of a building at the foot of the bridge. Folk art, as we talked about last time, folk art in that area really tells the story. This is the first. Anybody know about Jimmie Lee Jackson? Anybody heard of him before? Okay. Well, that's why we're doing this, because I hadn't really heard of him before. I started getting ready for this march either. And it's important for us to know these people's stories. So Jimmie Lee Jackson is the first of what they call the Selma Martyrs. He was born December 16th, 1938. He died February 26th, 1965. He was a resident of Marion, Alabama, which makes Selma look like a large town, which I tell you it's not. It's about 25 miles from Selma, I think. It's also notable because Coretta Scott King was from Marion, Alabama. So was Andrew Young's first wife, whose name escapes me right now. Jean. She was from Marion. And so was Hosea Williams' wife. So this little town contributed a lot to the movement. SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which John Lewis was a founding member of. Karis was a member of SNCC, weren't you, Karis? They had been organizing in Selma for about 2 years with limited results. They were trying to get people registered to vote there. There were 15,000 black people who were eligible to vote, and there were about 200 who were actually registered. So SNCC had been there for 2 years, had made very little progress. And so in January of 1965, the Reverend Fred Reese, whose picture we saw the first day, who was a school teacher and head of the Dallas County Improvement Association, which was basically a civil rights group, invited King and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to come to Selma and to essentially make it the epicenter of the voting rights movement. So King came and held a mass meeting at Brown Chapel, which is the church that's very close to the foot of the bridge in Selma, which was attended by 700 people. And they began laying the groundwork for a voting registration movement with Brown Chapel as the command central. They began a series of marches to the Dallas County Courthouse, which was the domain of Sheriff Jim Clark. Anybody heard of him? He was of the Bull Connor mold. He was as bad in many ways as Connor was in Birmingham. And he ruled the courthouse. So every day they would have a march from Brown Chapel to the courthouse. And they would try to go in, and he would be there blocking the door, not letting them in. And it became increasingly confrontational, violent. Now, all this was nonviolent on the behalf of the people who were protesting. The violence was all from the law enforcement, the officials. It became increasingly violent, though. There were arrests. The situation was escalating. They had a children's march, and 200 children marched to the courthouse, and the troopers and deputies said, "You want to march, we'll make you march," and they forced them at gunpoint and with clubs to run for 2 hours, or 2 miles. And if they stopped, they'd say, "You want to march," and they'd beat them and make them run again. This was our government officials in Alabama doing this. So that was going on in Dallas County. Marion, the next county over, things were escalating there too. There was a Southern Christian leadership worker named James Orange who was arrested. And on February 18th, they had a mass meeting in Marion at the Zion Methodist Church. And they decided to march from the church to the city jail, where they planned to sing outside Orange's cell. And all of this has been documented by reporters who attended the meeting in March. This was especially dangerous because it was happening at night. John Lewis says in his book, "We rarely staged marches at night. Too many things could happen. Too many things could not be seen." Let's see what the next. Okay. The marchers, when they were met in Marion by police, state troopers, and Sheriff Jim Clark. It wasn't even his county, but he came over to help, you know. And they were told to turn around. So instead they knelt and began praying. Suddenly all the street lights in town went out, conveniently. They were probably shot out by police. And the police and the troopers began beating marchers while white onlookers started joining in. There was general mayhem and chaos with people trying to get away, being chased by police. Among those attending the meeting were Jimmie Lee Jackson's mother, Viola, her right here, his grandfather, who's named Cager Lee, who is in his 80s. Jackson had taken them to the meeting, to the church, and he came to pick them up. So he wasn't even really part of the march. But when he got there, there was all this chaos going on. And somehow his grandfather found him in the chaos. The grandfather, 82 years old, had been clubbed in the head by troopers. He fell to the ground and was kicked by them, and somehow he got up and somehow found his grandson, Jimmie Lee. They fled to restaurant Mac's Cafe, owned by African Americans, for refuge, and they hoped that they would find Viola there, and she was there along with others. Now, does anybody have you seen the movie Selma? Okay, this is portrayed in the movie, except in the movie they have it happening in Selma. It didn't happen in Selma; it happened in Marion, but it was a pivotal part of the whole Selma movement. So they got into the cafe thinking that they had found refuge, and they found the mother, daughter, and then troopers burst into the cafe, swinging clubs and smashing light fixtures and sending glass flying through the room. They clubbed Viola in the head. Jimmie Lee Jackson saw his mother getting clubbed in the head, and he jumped in to protect her. The troopers grabbed him and pinned him up against a cigarette machine, and then a second trooper named James Fowler shot him twice in the stomach. He staggered outside. He wasn't killed immediately. He lay in the street for half an hour, with troopers coming by and kicking him and hitting him. Finally, he got taken to an infirmary, then to Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma. Now, Jimmie Lee, we go back to him. We don't know a whole lot about him. He was a poor African-American person living in rural Alabama. So lives weren't documented then like they are now. You know, you couldn't go to his Facebook page and find every moment of his life documented. So what is known about him is that he lived with his grandmother and his mother in a shack that didn't have running water or electricity. He did graduate from high school, which was an accomplishment in rural Alabama. There's some dispute over whether or not he served in the military. Now, I don't know why that can't be documented. I'm sure it could be if somebody really wanted to. Andrew Young says he was a Vietnam vet, that Jackson was a Vietnam vet. And a lot of things I read said that he had served in the Army. Then I read something else that said no, he hadn't served in the Army, so who knows. He worked a variety of jobs. At the time of his death, he was a pulpwood cutter, which is hard physical labor. What they do know for sure is that he was devoted to his grandfather. He was a deacon in the Baptist church. He had tried to register to vote 4 times, but other than that, he wasn't really active in the movement. His grandfather and mother were, but he really wasn't. So he was an unlikely civil rights martyr. There were even disputes about how he died. They took him to an infirmary, then took him to the hospital in Selma, which was the closest hospital. He had surgery performed by one of the hospital's 2 black doctors, Dr. William Dinkins. A week later, Dinkins said Jackson was recovering well, that he was going in and checking on him, that all of his vital signs were good. He seemed to be recovering. He was sitting up in bed talking. Then a white doctor came in and said that he thought that there was infection and that he needed more surgery. Dinkins did not think he needed more surgery, but he was the low man on the totem pole in the hospital, especially because he was black. And so he was taken into surgery. Now Dinkins, the doctor, said in a PBS documentary years later that he believes Jackson died from lack of oxygen in the second surgery. He was in there, he said, I saw his blood turn dark. I said to the anesthetist, you need to put him on 100% oxygen. The white doctor said no, give him more anesthesia. So that's what the anesthetist did. Said the next thing I knew, he stopped breathing. So it's really unclear how he died, whether it was truly from infection or whether it was a botched second surgery. But he died on February 26th, 1965, 8 days after he was shot. While he was in the hospital, he was charged with assault and battery with intent to murder a police officer. Now, all the witnesses who were in the cafe, who were not law enforcement, said no way. That he jumped in to protect his mother, but that he did not assault anyone. Okay. This is when they came to the hospital to claim his body, which is right here. His funeral, 1,000 people attended his funeral. Most of them had to stand outside in the rain. His body. Martin Luther King, who I'm pretty sure Jimmie Lee Jackson never actually met in life, but King gave the eulogy. He spoke at the eulogy, and again, this is, I think, so important and so amazing. He spoke at this eulogy about this man who had been murdered by police. King spoke about forgiveness and love. He pleaded with people to pray for the police, to forgive the murderer, and to forgive those who were persecuting them. A white person who was at the funeral wrote, "We never heard one note of anger or revenge in the service. Instead, a spirit of courage emanated from the congregation, especially as they rose to sing the old slave song, 'Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around.'" Doing the wrong thing. Here they are. Everyone followed the hearse on foot in a procession to an old slave cemetery, which was where Jackson was buried. You see Andrew Young, King, is that Abernathy, and John Lewis, all people who are well known in Atlanta. During the procession, James Bevel, who was one of the leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who's not in that picture, he suggested that instead of going to the cemetery, they should take Jackson's body to Montgomery, and that they should walk the entire 54 miles and put his casket on the steps of the state capitol and not leave until George Wallace came out to see them. They didn't do that. They just buried him in the cemetery. But the idea, that's where the idea of the march was born, right there. And the next month, okay, here's his tombstone, and you can't really see it, but there's bullet holes in it. People have shot at it. Perry County, that's the county where it is. This is a memorial near the church. Now, a lot of these are pictures that I just found online. We did not go to Marion, so I didn't get to see the grave or these monuments. Here he is, Mr. James Bernard Fowler. He was not indicted by an all-white grand jury. Now, you get to serve on the jury or the grand jury, they choose from whom? Registered voters. But the odds of getting a black person on the jury, very, very low. The next year, he shot and killed another black man named Nathan Johnson. And after that, he was promoted. But he got fired in 1968 for beating a fellow officer. So he was just a real gem. In 2007, he was indicted. So the first time he was not indicted. But in 2007, he was indicted. You know, there's some really courageous prosecutors in Alabama who have gone back and are trying to get justice in some of these old cases. In 2010, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He was indicted for first-degree murder. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 6 months in prison. And he was released after 5 months. And he's still alive, still lives in Alabama, but he has dementia now. I read an article online, a newspaper article interviewing his daughter sometime around the 50th anniversary, so sometime in the last couple of months. And the daughter sounds totally unrepentant and sounds like, you know, she's proud of her dad and all he's done. And was very hostile to the reporter. So that's, any questions about any of this or comments?
So he never expressed remorse at all?
Not that I know, not that's publicly recorded. He may have, but not publicly.
So which of the leaders who were actually at the event
At,
where he was murdered?
I'm not sure that any of them
Okay.
were at the event. I don't know, that's a good question. I don't know if any of them had come over to participate in that march from the church to the jailhouse where they were gonna sing. I don't know, I think that was all local people. I don't think.
Now, was this before Bloody Sunday?
Yes,
Yeah.
this is in February. This is
Right.
February. He was shot on the 18th, I think, and died, I've got it written down. Yeah, died on the 26th. So, he died a couple of weeks before Bloody Sunday.
But they'd already asked Martin Luther King to come over to help
Right.
organize, so.
So to organize a voting rights
Right,
drive.
right.
So the idea hadn't happened yet of the march.
Right.
The idea of the march really came at his funeral or on the way to the cemetery. So but Jimmie Lee Jackson's death really was the impetus for the march. So he was, as I said, he himself had not really been a leader in the movement. He wasn't really involved in the movement, but his death became the catalyst for what happened next. Yeah.
I'm curious about Fowler. Do we know if he's a deacon in his church?
Who knows? Probably not now since he has dementia, but who knows whether people could lead all sorts of double lives.
Well, I
it
mean,
seemed like.
because part of the
Yeah.
dichotomy of the civil rights movement
Yeah.
is that some churches were just full of racists. I mean,
Right.
but they thought of themselves
Oh,
as
the
God-fearing
Klan used
people.
to meet in churches, so, yes. And they thought they were sometimes doing God's work.
Was there any national publicity about any of this?
There was, yeah, there was, but not as much, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Because you see, out of the 4 who were killed, Jimmie Lee Jackson's the only black man who was killed, although many, many black people, of course, were killed. His probably got the least amount of national coverage.
You said Fowler was indicted, finally. What was he indicted for?
He was indicted for Jimmie Lee Jackson's murder in 2007. He was indicted. In 1965, they did not indict him.
Yeah.
So he was indicted in 2007 by a prosecutor. I think he gave an interview to a newspaper where he said, yeah, I shot him. It was self-defense. And that was the first time he had ever publicly said that. And some prosecutor read that and decided to go after him again, even almost 40 years later. And so, I guess more than 40 years later, 42 years later. So he was, and they got the indictment that time. But why it took from 2007 indicted to 2010 before he pleaded to the lesser charge of manslaughter, and then only was sentenced to 6 months. So, justice.
You had the same thing happen with many other murders
Yeah.
that have only been prosecuted in the last 10 or so years.
That's right. A lot of these civil rights cases were not prosecuted at the time, and of course we're kind of running out of time now because a lot of the people who were involved, as we'll see, are no longer alive. Any other questions about Mr. Jackson?
Strikes me that William Faulkner would have made a wonderful novel out of his demented memories of his career as a policeman.
Right. Of course, his thing was that it was all self-defense.
Yeah.
And that they also argued that he was defending the other black people from, that's why they were there that night. So, don't try to make too much sense. Oops. The Reverend James Reeb. Now, has anybody heard of him? Back up, after Jimmie Lee Jackson's murder, they decided to do the march to Montgomery from Selma. Now, I also read there's a little bit of bad blood between Marion and Selma, because Selma got all the attention, and Marion is where this happened, and nobody knows about Marion, everybody knows about Selma. And we know what happened on Bloody Sunday then, when they tried to do the march, and were stopped on the bridge and clubbed. Now, King was not part of that march. John Lewis and Hosea Williams were at the front of the line that day. But after Bloody Sunday, King came back into town and called on people of faith across the country to come and help. James Reeb was one of the ones who answered that call. He was raised in Kansas and Casper, Wyoming. He attended seminary at Princeton and was ordained a Presbyterian minister. He later became drawn to the Unitarian Church because of its emphasis on social action. So in 1959, he moved with his wife, Marie, and children. Ultimately, he had 4 children, to Washington, where he became an assistant at All Souls Unitarian Church. He was ordained a Unitarian minister in 1962. And his job was to focus on urban and racial issues and problems in Washington.
Excuse me, when you
Yeah.
say he moved to Washington, are you talking about D.C.?
D.C.
Okay.
Yeah. Since he was from the West, you might think it was Washington State, Washington, D.C. He was at a big church. It was kind of a prestigious job. Although he wasn't the senior pastor, it was prestigious to be on the staff of that church. And the church brought them a nice house in a nice neighborhood, something that churches once did. But by January 1964, he was becoming restless with parish ministry, and he started looking for something else. His boss at the church, the senior minister, Duncan Howlett, said, Jim was singularly dedicated to a high concern for all people from all walks of life. This concern expressed itself among the poor living near the church, most of whom were Negroes. This was a man with fresh ideas, bright intelligence, original, yet with an extraordinary amount of modesty. So in 1964, he accepted a job in Boston with the American Friends Service Committee to try to improve the housing situation for low-income black families. He took a salary cut from his nice job in Washington and moved his family, which by this time included 4 kids, from the nice neighborhood that the church had bought the house in Washington to one of the poorest neighborhoods in Boston. He thought if he was going to be working on housing issues, he needed to live among the people he was working with. And so he moved his whole family into one of the poorest neighborhoods in Boston. And he enrolled his kids in the public schools there. Someone offered to pay for private school for the kids. And he said no, he wanted them to go to the schools where they lived and where they were working. So they became the only white kids in the school. His thought was that he would do this for a couple of years and then he would probably go back to parish ministry. But a year after he made this move, Bloody Sunday happened on March 7th, 1965. The next morning, King issued a call to religious leaders to come to Selma. And here's what King said. In the vicious maltreatment of defenseless citizens of Selma, where old women and young children were gassed and clubbed, we have witnessed an eruption of the disease of racism, which seeks to destroy us all. It is fitting that all Americans help to bear the burden. Join me in Selma. In this way, too, Americans will testify that the struggle in Selma is for the survival of democracy in our land. That was what King said. Reeb heard that about noon on Monday, March the 8th, the day after the march. And immediately he called home and talked to his wife, who was not enthusiastic about him going to Selma. Then he called his boss and said he thought he should go, even though his wife didn't want him to. By mid-afternoon, he had decided he was going to go. He went home, he booked an 11 p.m. flight from Boston to Atlanta, then on to Montgomery from Atlanta. He ate supper with his family, he tucked his kids into bed, he read them a story, and then he packed his suitcase and left the house about 10 p.m. He arrived in Selma about 9 a.m. on Tuesday, March the 11th, no, Tuesday, March the 9th. And about 50 Unitarian ministers were there, all from all over the country, who had also answered King's call. And there were a lot of clergy from a lot of other denominations, including a lot of Episcopalians, I might add. The Episcopal Church and the Unitarian Church, for some reason, really responded well to King's call and were involved a lot in the movement. That morning, about the time that Reeb was arriving in Selma, a federal court judge named Frank Johnson issued an injunction temporarily prohibiting any march. And remember, this was Tuesday. They had tried to march on Sunday. That was Bloody Sunday. They didn't even make it across the bridge. King agonized over what to do. He had these people coming in from all over the country who were ready to march. They had a mass meeting at Brown Chapel. About 2,000 people showed up, and they all got in line ready to head for the bridge and all the way to Montgomery this time. Jim Reeb was in the ranks of those marchers, most of whom didn't know anything about the judge's injunction. Again, this was not in the days where news you found out immediately. You had to wait for the evening news to hear what was going on. So King knew about the injunction, but all these other people did not know. So King agonized over what to do, and he decided he would march anyway. So as they came across the bridge, they were lined up 2 by 2, came across the bridge. They got to the same spot where the marchers had gotten on Bloody Sunday, and there was a line of state troopers waiting for them, as there had been on Bloody Sunday. And the state troopers told them they could go no further. And King called for everyone to kneel in prayer, which, if you remember, Jim Lewis had done on Bloody Sunday. And the troopers moved in as they were kneeling and praying. This time the troopers stayed put. They knelt in prayer, and for about 10 minutes they prayed and sang, and then King got up and turned around and headed back towards the church. And that's called Turnaround Tuesday, much to the dismay of many of the marchers, who were all primed and ready to keep going. But King knew that they were going to get the injunction, that was inevitable. One of the things that the judge said was that they didn't have enough time to get the protection together. So it wasn't that they didn't have the right to march. He didn't say that. He said that they couldn't do it on this day. So Reeb and 2 other Unitarian ministers, Clark Olson from California, a guy named Olaf Miller, decided to go to dinner. They asked Diane Nash, is that a name that's familiar to any of you? She was very active in the movement, an African-American woman from Nashville. They asked her to recommend a place to eat. And she said, do you want to eat with your kind? Meaning, do you want to eat in a segregated all-white restaurant? And they said, no, of course not. So she directed them to Walker's Cafe in Selma, which was owned by African Americans. And so they went there to eat, and the place was full of civil rights workers, because it was within walking distance of the church. So after they ate, Reeb got up and called home from the restaurant phone booth. Remember, in those days, restaurants had phone booths that you could put money in and make a phone call home. He told his wife he was going to stay, told her what had happened, told her he was going to stay for a couple more days to see what happened, to see if they were going to be able to march. And then he left with Olson and Miller. I don't know whether he had known them before that day or not, but they'd gone about a block and this is evening, when they heard people coming up behind them calling them white niggers. And they tried to ignore it and just keep on walking. Then one of the group smashed a 5-foot-long 2x4 into Reeb's head and said, "Now you know what it feels like to be a real nigger." Olson said it was a two-handed swing in the style of a left-handed batter. So it's just like hitting him in the head with a baseball bat, except bigger. He said the man's face was intense and vicious. Reeb fell to the ground. The others were hit and knocked to the ground, but not seriously injured. And then the 4 assailants fled into the night. Olson and Olaf helped Reeb get up. They staggered back to Diane Nash's office. She called a doctor, and a hearse, which doubled as an ambulance, took him to the infirmary. And there, Dr. Dinkins, the same man who 3 weeks ago had been involved in taking care of Jimmie Lee Jackson, decided Reeb had to go to an emergency neurosurgery place, and the closest was in Birmingham, which was 90 miles away. So they called the hospital to say they were coming. And the hospital said, "Don't come if you can't bring $150 with you," which they didn't have. But Diane Nash got the money together, and they headed for Birmingham in the hearse ambulance. Just north of Selma, they had a flat tire. Dinkins ordered the driver to ride on the rim until they got to a place where it was safe for a mixed group of blacks and whites to be seen together, where they could call for a replacement ambulance. They had to wait 2 hours for another ambulance to get there. During that 2 hours that they were waiting, the police came by and taunted them, refused to give them a police escort, refused to get another ambulance there for them. They finally did make it to the hospital, where they discovered that Reeb had a massive skull fracture and blood clot, and he died 36 hours later on March 11th, Tuesday, March 11th. I don't know that he even ever made it into surgery, but this is one of the men who was with him. He squeezed my hand tighter and tighter, so the pain grew worse, and then he lapsed into unconsciousness. Now this death was big news all around the country. Does anybody remember seeing news of that? There were vigils and protests held in a lot of cities around the country. There was much more coverage of James Reeb's death than there had been of Jimmie Lee Jackson's death. As one of the people who I was reading this week said, the tragic irony was that the murder of a white citizen generated more media attention and condemnation of Southern racist violence than the death of many blacks in the civil rights struggle. 4 men were arrested. Well, here, this is from the newspaper from Casper, Wyoming. So you see it was news around the country. Of course, that was where he had his wife and 3 of his children at the funeral. 4 men were arrested. No, Martin Luther King speaking at the funeral. I'll get back to it. I've got them in somewhere. William Hoggle, who was 37. His brother Naaman Hoggle, who was 30. Elmer Cook, who witnesses say was the one who swung the club that killed Reeb. And a guy named R.B. Kelly, who was 30. All but Kelly were indicted for murder on April 13th. The trial began December 7th, 1965. Olson and Orloff identified Cook as the person who assaulted Reeb. The jury deliberated, again an all-white jury, deliberated 90 minutes with Sheriff Jim Clark paying a visit to the jury room during those 90 minutes. And after 90 minutes, all the men were acquitted. King preached at this eulogy too. He was busy doing eulogies. He said, James Reeb symbolizes the forces of of goodwill in our nation, he demonstrated the conscience of the nation. He was a witness to the truth that men of different races and classes might live, eat, and work together as brothers. His crime was that he dared to live his faith. He said, I can say to you this afternoon, my friends, that in spite of the tensions and uncertainties of this period, something profoundly meaningful is taking place. Old systems of exploitation and oppression are passing away. Out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. Doors of opportunity are gradually being opened. There, at the bottom of society, shirtless and barefoot people of the land are developing a new sense of somebodyness, carving a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of despair. People who stand in darkness have seen a great light. The kingdom of God may yet reign in the hearts of men. That was from his funeral. Now this, I didn't see this. This is, I found these pictures online. But this is the spot where he was killed in Selma. Okay, that looks like, well, the restaurant would have been, I don't know if the restaurant is still there or not. It was about a block from the restaurant where he was killed. You see these in his honor. Icons. Now this is an icon of him and the actual march that came after. This is his son. This is his oldest son, who was 13 at the time of his murder. And this, holding his picture, and this is a recent picture, and I think his daughters, or maybe his granddaughters, that may be Reeb's great-granddaughter. They held a special showing of the movie Selma, because this is in the movie. If you saw the movie, and they had a special showing of the movie for his family. So these are his son, I think a daughter and granddaughters, holding his picture after seeing the movie. These are the guys who did it. R.B. Kelly, Elmer Cook, William Bogle. He's the one who, they said, swung the club. He's going to come up later, too.
Tricia,
Yeah,
were they in the Klan or were they just unaffiliated?
I think they were in the Klan. I'm not sure. I think they were, because there was a restaurant in Selma called the Blue Moon Cafe, the Silver Moon Cafe. I've got it written somewhere. And they were at that restaurant that night and saw, and had come out of the restaurant, saw Reeb coming out of the other restaurant, which was a black restaurant, these white men coming out of the black restaurant. He's going to come up again, and we'll have to do it next week, with Viola Liuzzo, who's the next person who was killed. And her killers were in the Klan, and they were eating dinner in the restaurant that night, and which was just 2 weeks later. And Elmer Cook came up to them and said, "I've done my job. When are you going to do yours?" So, and that night they killed Viola Liuzzo. So, I think he was in the Klan. Any other questions about James Reeb or comments about any of this?
Do you know what happened to his family? Did they stay in Boston or?
No, they went back to Wyoming. And his wife is still alive. I tried to find a picture of her and couldn't. And she's referred to in the articles that the family was interviewed several times around the 50th anniversary and the release of the movie. So I was able to find some pictures of them, but they referred to their mother, but she was not interviewed. Yeah.
You know, I don't know whether it was the James Reeb or Jonathan Daniels, but Ed Jackson, who was Episcopal minister here at St. Dunstan's who left the active ministry he was serving in Birmingham because the Episcopal bishop would not do something about these deaths, a death or these deaths. So we have a very direct connection, and I don't know that Ed was ever in any of the marches, but he basically came to Atlanta because of that.
Well, we've got just a couple more minutes, and I'll talk about that Bishop Carpenter is his name. And you remember when we were doing the letter, Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, that one of the people to whom that letter was addressed was Bishop Carpenter, who, the Episcopal bishop, there were 6 clergy men, they were all men of course, who took out an advertisement in the Birmingham paper asking King to leave, basically, and calling him an outside agitator. And King's letter was addressed to them, but also addressed to a broader audience of white moderates who were basically sitting on the sidelines and wanting the courts to enact things. They didn't want any protests. Carpenter has taken a lot of heat for that over the years, and his son has really tried to reclaim his father's legacy, I guess, and tried to say that he wasn't really as bad as it sounded like he was from that letter. One of the things I read this week, and we'll get to it when we're talking about Jonathan Daniels, who was an Episcopal seminarian, was that more and more clergy kept coming in as these things happened. And there were many, many Episcopal clergy and bishops who came in. And Carpenter issued a statement saying that no bishops or priests who were in Alabama for this movement could celebrate the Eucharist at any Episcopal church. So that doesn't sound like he made much progress to me.
So were these guys prosecuted recently?
No, they've all died, so they just all got away. Then here we go back. This is current day. This was our walking the third day. It was a hilly day. It's my friend Heidi. American flags kept appearing. I don't know. We started out with one, and we had his picture last time, the 11-year-old boy whose father had given him books to read about the march. They were from St. Louis. It was their spring break, and he saw that there were kids who carried the flag in the original march, so he carried the flag all 54 miles. And other people started carrying flags too. Pretty powerful, you see. We're getting up to Viola Liza's memorial, the place where she was killed. And although I look like I'm asleep, I'm actually taking notes. And here is the memorial to her, near the spot where she was killed. And we'll start with her next week.
She was the one from Michigan, right?
She was from Michigan, yes.
How many of you did the entire march?
300. So now we're getting to the march, the actual march, which happened March 21st through March 25th of 1965. So that's all. I didn't think I would get through all 4 of them. So I hope you don't mind doing the next 2 next week.
Very well done. Thank you.
Any other questions before we go?
Listening to NPR, and they were talking about Baltimore.
Okay, so next time it's Viola Liuzzo and Jonathan Daniels.
The actress lived in there.
And